Okay. I am procrastinating. I have a kind of a fairly big workload this afternoon, but it's my lunch hour, so screw 'em. I'm just going to take it. Wanted to yak at this screen for a little bit. Um, what come to mind today is generational trauma, particularly that generation we love to bash so much recently, the baby boomer generation, and the lovely after effects and aftermath of the upbringing they gave us, from their strange and flawed worldview that continues to just cause us all sorts of grief today. Now, of course, when you talk about generations, you're speaking in very broad generalities. Obviously, no individual is the same as anybody else, and but this is we do see a broad spectrum of behavior, that we all, especially Generation X underneath them, um, because we are powerless. There are way fewer of us than there are of them, and there are way more millennials than there are of us. So we will never actually be in a position of power, despite whatever we may do. Now that we are aging in, and they're finally starting to age out of positions of authority in corporate America and in the Congress and such. And there are a few Generation X people, each with their own kind of twisted stuff too, leadership as usual. Um, but there are things that every generation is kind of known for in terms of their general quality, and worldview, based on their shared experiences about what was going on in the world, how their parents, their general attitudes were and such, that does carry forth. There's an adage that talks about, the four generational cycle. That's basically, strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create good men, right? And we're apparently in the hard times create good men phase. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it does actually kind of ring true when you look at generational cycles. The equivalent of the baby boomer generation lived in the 1880s. And when you look at that generation, there was a lot of upheaval during their youth, and as they aged in. It was after the Civil War. The country was reconstructing. We were on the way to the golden era, or golden, the Gilded Age, where we know that the labor movement started to really catch fire. Feminism, and women's rights, the early waves of feminism started to take off, and there was kind of a decadent lifestyle, that was the society was known for, that obviously collapsed quite rapidly and severely when the Great Depression set in, starting in 1929, right? Um, so, which arguably that generation, and I don't remember the colloquialism for it, they were kind of at the wheel for when that happened, because of you know their upbringing during a prosperous time, more or less, in the United States, and their mishandling of it. And that's kind of the same thing that we're seeing right now, is that the world, the generation after World War II, um, grew into this prosperous world, especially in the United States, where things were rebuilding and things were getting better and things were cheap and all these other things. And so they have this kind of not just twisted view of what modern reality is, but almost an aggressive expectation, an entitlement that they have, as a whole, about the way things should be for them versus what the realities on the ground are, especially for us. And we see that evidenced in things like, you need to pull yourself out and up in your bootstraps. You should be living on your own. You should have a job. Why don't you have a car? You're just lazy. Nobody wants to work anymore. All that other stuff, and they're not paying attention to the fact that the minimum wage, for example, when you're talking about buying power, you can't even buy a hamburger really at McDonald's anymore for an hour's worth of labor, compared to when they flipped burgers, in their day as kids. They could save up enough to buy a car from their fast food job. I'm not being very hyperbolic about that either. Their lives were so blessed, in their upbringing in terms of the prosperity that surrounded them. But they also suffered, I would argue, in their defense, suffered a lot of strange traumas that we don't really often acknowledge from their parents and their grandparents and such, because of the hardships that those generations had faced, that had kind of put them in a tough spot with their parents. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about my own experience. I won't trauma dump on you, but my mother was pretty young. She was 22 when I was born. My sister came along 9 years later, so I was an only child from a childhood development perspective, right? But my mother, um, she was a party animal, and she was, from all my understanding, obviously I wasn't there, she was somewhat promiscuous. And that's not a value judgment. I honestly believe that there is a double standard that's unfairly held to women. I think the real issue with that kind of thing is that you have to guard your heart. You have to approach, casual sexual encounters with a mature frame of mind. And if you are using sex to get love and you are just jumping from person to person, just trying to get that need filled, using that as a medium to try to convince men usually to do that, then you're going to end up with your heart broken and you're going to have a difficult time, right? That's kind of the issue I see with her. My father, here's an interesting fun fact about me. My father is a police officer. Now, interestingly, he's retired. I don't even know if he's alive anymore. But he was a police officer on a place called Vashon Island, which is in sight of the city of Seattle. It is in King County, but you can only get there by ferry. So it's actually pretty rural even today. It's hard to get to. They've talked about building a bridge over there, and the people who live there are like, we don't want it. We want to stay just like things are here. So it's really difficult to commute to Seattle. I don't think there's even a ferry, at least there wasn't when I was growing up, directly to Seattle. You had to go to a closer port called Fauntleroy, which didn't have a highway to it. You had to take this weird back, it's a boulevard, but it's not something. If you work in Seattle and you live in Vashon, you're in for a hard time getting to and from work, right? But my grandparents had a cabin there, that they would take me to on the weekends and stuff. But that's where my father lived. And so he was basically a cop in this really sleepy town. Nothing really happened, and that's how he liked it. He was an authority with very little actual problems to address. There's actually a newspaper of him being completely asleep in his squad car while the mini mart or whatever got robbed by somebody across the street from him. But what he would do, him and his friends, this is another reason why I don't really trust or like cops, okay? They would go into the lockup of their, the evidence and stuff that they had grabbed from the people they'd pull off the street and grab hard drugs. And then they would go out and party on the town, inviting girls with these drugs. And my mother was one of those people. Now she was arguably using sex to earn his affection. He was very standoffish. I believe he was engaged at the time that he was seeing her. She had become pregnant and then decided to not be pregnant, because he told her to do so. The second time that happened, though, she decided, well, you know what? I'm keeping this one and maybe he'll stick around. That was her thought. He did not stick around. But fortunately, she did not make that hard decision, and that means I'm here. But there's another adage that says that half of Generation X was killed in the womb. Regardless of how you feel about abortion and all that stuff, I think that statistically, when you look at how few of us there are compared to how many boomers there are and what you would expect the fertility rate to be, they're remarkably, we are a small generation compared to them. Now, the pill became widely available in 1969 or 1970, depending on which state you were in. That was, women had good arguments and good grievance against the disparity of this stuff, of course. And then abortion, of course, we know Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973. 1974, up until recently, was the lowest birth rate year on record in the United States. And it's not contentious to say those were big factors. Okay. Again, this isn't about women's rights or anything like that. It's just that that was the reality, right? This was a new thing that was available when it hadn't been before, especially, when you hear about how things were getting taken care of before Roe versus Wade and how things are starting to work out now. Although it's legal in some states, you're a murderer in others. Like, oh, yeah, that's a whole. Ugh. Anyway, that's a whole thorny subject that I've got plenty of feelings about, and I blame the Congress. I don't blame anyone else. I don't blame women. I don't blame conservatives. I don't blame the courts. I blame Congress for not doing their job there. But anyway, um, but she was young when she had me, and she was an only child herself. And her parents had been quite old. My grandmother was 46 when my mother was born. My grandmother had been malnourished, um, and had been kicked out of her home because there was too many mouths to feed when she was like 15. And she had suffered 8 miscarriages before my mother, because of the state of her body. And it was considered a minor medical miracle that my mother was born healthy and on to term, as she was. And of course, her parents were older and they had been trying for a long time and suffered all that trauma of having miscarriages. And so they really doted on her. And that came out in her personality. And there was nothing they wouldn't do for her. They bought her a house. These were the days. They bought her a house when she decided, I'm not living with you anymore. I've got a child or whatever. They bought her a whole house in White Center. Not a great neighborhood, but it was little, but it was a house. And that's where my earliest memories are formed, is in that house that her parents bought for her flat out when she was 22 or 23 years old. It's absolutely wild. It was everything I could do, buy a car for my daughter when she turned 21, 22. But um, she, being this party animal, even though she liked me, I was a burden and I was a pain in her ass. It was just a simple fact. It's not that she was cruel, she was neglectful. She would pawn me off on whoever would take me. My grandparents died when I was about 2 or 3 on her side, from various heart disease. Probably had to do with their eating and the chemicals and all that other stuff that generation just dealt with. But she didn't have anyone really to give me to, and so I was staying at random people's places. I am so lucky. Um, to the best of my knowledge, the best of my memory, I was not really ever abused. I didn't like certain people because they were mean or whatever, but nobody actually did anything truly traumatic to me as far as I remember. Okay, that's all I can say. It's not to say that it didn't happen. I just don't know. But there are a lot of dangerous situations that I was in because of this neglect. One time she had to go to work. She had no one to watch me, so she left me at home all day. I was like 3 years old, and she's like, "I'll be back," but it was a long time for a little kid, you know. And at one point, I couldn't take it. I just started bawling. I wanted my mom, and I was wandering out in the yard looking for her and everything, yelling for her. And the parent, the neighbors caught wind of this, and they called CPS. And the message I got from my mother: if you do that again, they will, those people will come and they will take you away from me. She didn't take any accountability. She didn't say, that'll never happen again or any of that other stuff. It was on me. And this kind of behavior is what formed a lot of my self independence to a great fault. And there are many people like me. This is, stuff that, you work through with therapy because you're just all messed up after coming out of a household like that. But a lot of this stuff I just thought was normal. I thought it was, this is how you lived your life. You gotta hold that in, man, and you can't have needs, and you have to make sure that you are pleasant and accommodating to people to make sure that they don't abandon you or you don't get taken away or any of that other stuff. You had to just hold it together, man. You just hold it together. And that was the lesson that I got from her when I was very young. She married a man. She met a man. She didn't marry him for many years, but he basically became dad when I was about 5 years old. And he had many things going on with him too. But his wound evidenced themselves as him being a workaholic. He would just bust his ass all the time. And he would have little side projects, little side hustles that he would work on in the evening when he'd come home. We built nest boxes for birds and cages for birds and stuff that we would sell to, this supply shop called Silver Song. I remember that. We grow vegetables in the garden, all sorts of stuff that he was always, doing. But that also involved drugs a little bit. They had a weed grow operation for a little while when I was a kid in the basement. They had they had he was connected, knew who the man who was known as the coke dealer in West Seattle, and he would hold his stash for him for some sort of favor or whatever when the heat was getting heavy. He would have supply somewhere in the house. I don't know exactly where. I only understood this later as I grew older. Um, that guy, he was armed to the teeth. He was a scary dude. But strangely enough, I just through happenstance, I became really good friends with his nephew when I was in middle school. And it's funny because his parents were like, when they first met me and realized who I was, and I was just a kid, and he was just a kid, and so we just were buddies, and then that became a thing. Um, but this neglect uh, echoes through my life still. I still have a feeling of incredible responsibility with no expectation of return, and in fact, part of my issues are the fact that I feel like I need to give. I have to if I don't want people to get away. Now that comes out evidenced in ways that I actually just like to help and like that actualization of interacting with people. I think it's a fairly healthy thing for the most part. How I interact with people, I really enjoy them, and I want them to be happy in my life. I truly do. And is there a way I can help you? But I just have to make sure not to stretch myself too thin, where my own needs aren't getting met, and I frazzle and burn out. And here I am, divorced man that I am, still dealing with that, so because of the way I, crashed and burned. But anyway, the entitlement that she felt as she grew up, things had to be perfect. When I say that, it's like she wanted the quality stuff. That she didn't make perfection in her life and didn't expect other people necessarily to be perfect. She just didn't expect them to cause her any trouble. Just get out of my face. There, and sometimes I'd have to push it. It is cold outside. I need a jacket for school to get to school because I walk to school. You have to get me clothes. These are conversations that I had when I was, young, early teenager and stuff. And rattle her off the couch and go take care of business for me when I had no power to do it any other way. Um, but I was alone a very large portion of my childhood because Steve was gone working most of the time, and she would be gone working or doing whatever. And I played a lot of solitaire. I played Monopoly by myself. Learned how to play chess by myself. I played a lot of video games. I did a video yesterday or 2 days ago about staring at that black box for hours. Um, but this is the foundation of my growing up, is because my mother was not malignant but neglectful, and that had to do with her entitlement and somewhat to her drug use. She had really hurt her brain during her 20s from the stuff that she was doing and taking, and that you don't heal some of that damage. And her mood swings were crazy and all this other stuff. But compared to a lot of my other friends who had extremely controlling parents, religious zealots of one form or another, or they had temper problems or drinking problems or whatever, I kind of lucked out in a lot of ways, and I thought things were okay. And you don't always know. You're just a kid. You think this is normal. You're just growing up this way. Um, but enough about me. When I think about her and her generation, okay, my grandfather was a World War II vet who killed probably thousands of people because he was dropping bombs during World War II for many years. It was, when you look, a good way to understand it is to read or watch Catch 22, because it was an industrial process. You know, you load the bombs onto the plane, you get on the plane, you're on a team with seven guys. There's flak being, people trying to shoot you down because you're going to kill people, dealing with guys that are flying these, there's a whole, you'd fly these planes, okay, and you'd have an escort of fighters, but the fighters did not have the ability to have the range that the bombers did, and so the fighters would eventually peel off because they would run, they were going to run low on fuel, and as soon as that happened, that's when the enemy fighters would come, and you had like special B-17s that instead of bombs, they were outfitted with massive amounts of guns to be the protectors and stuff. This was something that he did on a daily or weekly basis, just constantly, every day, Monday through Friday, or whatever his schedule was. It's not quite like that, but that was it. And you just, and then you're gonna drop a bunch of bombs on people. Who knows who's down there, but those are women and children and stuff down there. And he managed to hold that in. I don't know how he slept with himself at night, but he did, and he had a very rigid lifestyle. The military taught him a lot, and he carried that through to the end of his days, more or less, except for the stroke that he suffered, that he, obviously was no longer there. A stroke like that, you're dead. That person is gone. Just face it. Anytime you take any significant brain injury, you're not dealing with the same person anymore. I knew an old man when I worked at the restaurant who, his name was Gary, and he had had a stroke, and he drooled. He was a nice fella, and his kids would basically leave him at the restaurant for hours at a time. He'd drink his coffee and read the newspaper or color, whatever he was doing. He was just kind of this guy. But so, he would you talk to him, he would say stuff like, I'm not a nice person. I was never a nice person, or whatever. And all accounts said that he was a son of a bitch before he had that stroke. But I always knew him as this gentle person, right? So that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate there. Uh, but that generation, my grandparents' generation, went through World War II. Okay. And at the very least, you're being rationed. You had to remember the greater good. You couldn't drive a bunch. You had to not eat meat. You had to not use copper. Everyone was going without for the war effort. It was a contributive, collaborative effort. Buy war bonds, like all that stuff. So even if you were stateside and you didn't directly involve in the war, you were always kind of worried, is it going to come over here? Obviously, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and they knew that men were dying. Everybody was getting letters from time to time. These families would get a letter, I'm sorry to tell you, your son has been killed in, the fields of Europe and stuff like that. It's happening a lot. And especially when you were a parent in their grandparents' generation, in their parents' generation, they were dealing with that trauma. Is Joe going to come home, or is he going to be in a box? Or when he comes home, he's missing half his face or something, They dealt with a lot. And then, of course, the Great Depression, which happened before World War II, you really did without. The trope of the hobo with the bindle stick, the stick with the napkin, wandering the train tracks, boiling inedible things like shoes to try to make a meal out of them. That was real. It became a comic trope, but people were desperate in those days. My grandparents on my mother's side lived through that. They were teenagers. My grandfather's father disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. The suspicion is that he owed the wrong people money, maybe because he was going to lose the farm or whatever. But indeed, he did lose the farm, and before, especially after he left, and his mother took his younger siblings back home to live with her sister, and said to my grandfather, who was 17 or something, you're a man now, and you're not coming with me. You got to go out on your own. I can't take care of you. They were turned out because they were a burden to their families, truly. And so he had to find his own way. And my grandmother, he met her at the train station. She didn't know what, she was homeless. Her parents had kicked her out because they didn't have a mouth to feed. She was malnourished and all this stuff. And she asked him where he was going. And he said, I think California. He had enough money to get one ticket to California. That was his plan. And she said, "Can I come with you?" And he realized at that moment it was a marriage proposal, because you didn't, people got married for love, so, of course, but a lot of people got married just because it was about teaming up and working together to make this happen, and that's what that was. And he couldn't afford to go to California, but he could buy 2 tickets to Seattle, so he took her with him to this other place. That's how I ended up there, that side of the family. um, and he crawled hands and knees to earn everything that he had. He did not use banks. He did not trust banks. That whole generation didn't trust banks for a good reason. And he bought everything with cash. He built everything with his hands. They shared work in the neighborhood and stuff like that. There's this whole community aspect that we don't have today. Absolutely not. We barely even talk to each other. I know I've spoken with 2 of my neighbors in this apartment complex. I share walls with them, basically. But so we talk about the boomers, okay? Their parents were traumatized by their lives, by their young lives. Okay, it's very simple. They had a war and or a Great Depression. They were usually very young when the Great Depression was happening, which formed their worldview. They were a bit older, sometimes of military age. Their friends would go off and die, or they would join the cause, that they felt was the thing to do. And uh, they came back home and nobody addressed that stuff. They talked about shell shock. They just, oh, he's got shell shock. You mean he survived the horrifying events of Guadalcanal, where men were being mown down and bombed to death by these desperate Japanese soldiers who knew that no one was coming for them, and they holed up in these pillboxes and gave them everything they had to stick it to them, knowing that they were going to die, and they pried that useless island loose for the greater good of democracy, and then come home. That shell shock, yeah, they were a little shell shocked. They didn't address this stuff. They didn't address it at all. You just got to move on. The war's over, man. Get past it. Life's good. Get a job. Don't be drinking. Don't be tripping balls. Get to work. That was how their parents were treating it, because they'd gone through all that horror too. Um, and society just in general didn't know how to deal with it. One of the things they also picked up from the family, I was just talking about this morning. Uh, you don't want to embarrass the family. Okay, these were tight knit communities a lot of the time. You rarely moved away. People were not nearly as mobile until the last few generations. So you would live with these people all your lives. Sometimes you'd attend a church or whatever. And if they knew that, you know, Uncle so and so was a raging alcoholic who beat the hell out of his kids, that would look bad on the family, right? So the kids didn't talk about that. The boomer kids did not talk about stuff like that. They get molested. And not only were their parents minimize this stuff, like, I've been through worse is probably a lot of where that comes from. But also, too, it's like, we don't want to talk about that. It's unpleasant. We stop talking about unpleasant things. We don't talk about it. You bury that stuff right down. I'm pretty certain part of the reason my mother was as promiscuous as she was is because she was abused by her uncle. I don't know that for sure, but when I put the story together in my head and the chain of events and the things that she's said over the many, many years, I think that's what happened. But she would never tell me. She would never tell me because of her own hangups. Um, these kids, the boomer kids, had this just traumatized set of parents, but they lived in a world of plenty. And these parents doted on them because now that the war was over, women get out of the factory, back into the kitchen with you. There was that element. So you had a bunch of mothers that were not real happy at society's sudden decision that their agency is no longer important. You got to move over for the men, right? That's a factor. I don't know how huge that factor was, but I'm sure there were plenty of women that were dissatisfied with this new expectation that they suddenly play house when they've had to pull their own weight for a long time and have that independence and went with that. And you have these men who were had survived by the skin of their teeth in some way, and they got married and had children that they had to take care of and have to be responsible people when they were barely holding it together themselves. But you could go get a job anywhere, making refrigerators or, you know, building cars or whatever. There was all sorts of work here. So much work falling out of the woodwork because Europe was wasted and Asia hadn't come up on the rise. There was no China like we think of now, no workshop of the world like it is now. And Europe wasn't. They were busy re- trying to replace their population and build basic functioning utilities for a long time. And we were a part of that. We lent them a lot of money. There's a whole political thing I can talk about there. So America was it, and we had all the money, we had all the jobs. It was great here, and college. If you were in the the GI Bill, college was free, but college was cheap as well. It's only in the '80s when Reagan was governor there that you started to see colleges turn into these money making mills of uselessness that they are today. Um, but they could get an education and go on to become a doctor or whatever very cheaply and easily. And there's plenty of demand for everything. And but they also, as time waned on for that generation, um, they started to have to deal with a lot of awful stuff that started to happen in the '60s and '70s. Right? Again, the same thing. The discontent that we saw in the 1890s and early 1900s and stuff, even a little bit before that, started to really spill up in the same way in the United States in the '60s and '70s. Obviously, you had the civil rights movement, which hadn't been a priority for the country for almost 100 years after Reconstruction, that's another subject that I can talk about. It's like, hey, we won this war to free the slaves. Oh, Andrew Johnson comes along. Well, we won't call them slaves, but we're not going to give them any rights. Let's put everything back, more or less. That's basically what happened after the Civil War. And the civil rights movement is kind of the price we paid, or some of us way higher than others, in order to get some semblance of what they deserved in the first place. But all that unrest was making people edgy, and it made people political. You think the country is divided now and it wasn't before. I promise you, in the '50s and '60s, this country was just as divided. The Red Scare, the whole idea that these commies were infecting our society, and I have in my hand a list of names, and have you no decency, sir? Like all these things that happened in the '50s and the '60s were just as politically divisive. They just didn't have social media plugging into your brain, poking at your amygdala to make you flip out in the same way. The message was framed by the government and by the newspapers, yes, but in a much softer fashion. But stuff was going on. Vietnam. Vietnam was a false flag operation. We lied about what happened to uh, the ship in the Gulf of Tonkin so that we could justify our involvement in trying to win Vietnam back for France. That's what that was to begin with. France had lost control. All those places had lost control of their colonial holdings in the '40s because their own home countries were getting devastated. Britain, same thing. I mean, you gotta worry about your holdings in the Falkland Islands when the Germans are bombing you daily in the Blitzkrieg. But um, the the aftermath and the effects that that social distress had on those people is not also very thought about. Watergate just was a massive scandal that there's distrust in this government. Now, a lot of times we think of the 1960s, we think of the summer of love and, drugs and the birth control pill so that everybody could just have sex all the time and hippies and, all this other stuff. You have to remember that the society was messed up, that was breeding this countercultural movement. And it's interesting that aspect, the hippie aspect, shows up in other cultures. In Japan, the whole idea, they call it the kawaii culture. It's kind of this happy-go-lucky nihilism that the cute little animals and all these other things kind of represent in art was really a just like the world is screwed, we're probably all going to die, let's just make the most of it kind of attitude that a lot of people started to develop in Japan during those days, right? Godzilla. Okay, think about this. Godzilla is a monster that lives in the ocean, and he's nuclear, of course, and he's impossible to stop. All you can do is try to direct him and focus his rage on something. If there's another monster, then they're going to be battling it out over with one another, and you're caught in the middle, and you can't do anything except hide and watch in horror. Two great powers fighting over each other that can wipe everyone out. A piece of media that comes out during the Cold War. The analogy is very easy to put together how they were feeling in general, what was going on under the surface. Storytelling, expressing what's going on in a way that you don't really even know how to articulate. Okay, tying into my previous video. So to think that this was a golden era is foolish. Okay, and they were dealing with their own traumas. The society was falling apart. The environment, you know, Lake Erie caught fire. It literally caught fire in 1970, I think, 71 something, because of all the toxic chemicals that were poured into it. Now, remember the world of the future in the 50s and 60s, this kind of Buck Rogers idea that we're constantly making progress and we're going forward and all these other things was a hopeful one, but we were playing God and had no thought about the consequences to our actions, not even cleaning up our own mess until things like that happened. And you can't really hold one person to account. This is generations of industrial waste. They had to start cleaning it up. And you look at the science fiction of the 1970s, up until Star Wars, that stuff is dark, boy. Death Race 2000 and Westworld and Soylent Green, stuff like that, all over the media. Again, stuff that is bubbling out from the common culture. This world of plenty could be destroyed at any minute. It almost happened in the 60s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those were kids that were having to deal with the parents listening intently to the news. We're at DEFCON 2. There's only one more place to go, and that's war. There's no going further up this ratchet. They were living in that kind of world, and they were helpless too. I was actually just talking with guys and listening to the Pink Floyd album, The Wall, and that I think is their finest album because it's addressing their internal struggles. And this guy has got everything. It's a story, one of those story albums. This guy's got everything, and he's semi-autobiographical in that it's about a character named Pink, the movie too, who is a fantastic artist. Everybody loves him. He's wealthy. He's got everything he wants. The girl that he's with, she is done with him. He's a mess. He's drugged out all the time on the road, cheating on her, all this other stuff. And he's so unhappy and he doesn't know how to fix it. And he's losing his mind is what that album is. And there's one song on there that just strikes my heart every time I listen to it. It's called Goodbye Blue Sky. And the line is, did you ever wonder why we had to run for shelter when the promise of a brave new world unfurled beneath the clear blue sky? That long, eloquent sentence, even right now, I'm feeling goosebumps saying that. You imagine growing up during the Blitzkrieg, you're a child, you have to run down, your parents would grab you and take you into some bomb shelter, which may or may not work. Everyone is terrified and these bombs are going off in the ground above you and everyone is not sure if they're going to make it through the night. And you come up and the world is devastated. And this is part of your daily life as a child. Daily, literally, the Blitzkrieg was for people in London. How do you move past that? I don't know, man. That's kind of what that song's about. This stuff runs deep in me, baby. So we have to understand that the reason why the boomers are so awful as an overall society, I would say, and selfish, God, they are remarkably selfish, is because they were doted on, but traumatized by their parents. And in return, the their parents were traumatized by the parents above them, and they themselves above them. We're all carrying the baggage that was dumped on us by the generation above us that raised us in some form or another. Now, some of us lucked out, man. I remember I was at my friend's fiance's house. We were all having dinner, and they're not religious. The first thing I thought is these are some religious people. No, they, not particularly. Maybe they are agnostic and maybe lightly Christian or whatever. They got knickknacks on their mantle, pictures of the family all along the hall in all various times, grandparents and even old black and white. And everyone sits down at this dinner table. A big old bowl of spaghetti. It's not a grand dinner. It's just bread and some vegetable like peas or whatever. It's just a dinner, and you just help yourself and load up your plate, and everybody's talking about their day. And I got angry. I got irrationally angry there. I actually had to storm off from that dinner. Now my friend comes up to me. He's like, "What's going on with you?" And I pieced it together, and I told him, "I can't help it. I'm so mad at Katie right now." And he's like, "Why?" And I said, "Because her family's so freaking perfect." It's not fair. I know. I can't help it. I am so envious, angrily so, because of how good she has it right now. She doesn't even know. You know, you grow up in a house that's empty half the time, cold because the power bill didn't get paid or whatever. And you come around a well-formed family like that seems to have it together. And I'm sure they had their issues. I'm certain there had to have been something. We've all got something. But that stability, which I wanted so desperately as a kid that I didn't even really realize until I was an adult, was something that I felt like I didn't, I never got. And I felt pissed off about it, unfairly to Katie, of course. And even I recognized how irrational that is, even in the moment, but still, you, Katie. But lots of people I know are like that. And half the people I know, really half the people I know, and this is younger and older, we all have whack histories, wild histories like mine of their family of origin. Not just even like, oh, my parents got divorced when I was 12. And there's that's traumatic as it is. Oh, we had to split custody or whatever, and he moved to Minnesota, and so I'd only visit him on the summer or whatever. Even that trauma is pretty bad. But that's not what I'm talking about. Those are the normal kids, right? um but um we can't be too hard on the boomers, even though we can try to stop them from the horrors they're wreaking on this planet, man, by voting the way they do and continuing to act in this selfish manner where they get theirs and then they kick the ladder out from underneath them so none of us can climb up, not letting go of homes for kids who need to raise their families now. Millennials are 40 years old and above now. That whole generation is not having sex, much less getting married and having children. The birth rate in 2022, I think 23, finally got lower than what it was in 1974, when it was, the aftermath of the summer of love, you know. And this is economic now. That's nothing to do with changes in cultural understandings or anything. It's because they can't afford to have kids. They can't even afford a place to live. They're still living 3 or 4 to an apartment and stuff, living on 40 hours a week. 40 hours a week meant you probably could support a family of 4 for the boomers. This has been taken from us by that generation. They have commoditized housing and turned it into an investment vehicle. Vehicles, cars are so expensive because of how complicated they are when they don't need to be. You can be energy efficient and all that other stuff without having the engine compartment absolutely crammed with electronics, that help your windshield wiper be more efficient and tell you what the temperature is out of whatever. You don't need all that. You don't. But we overcomplicate it and we make things intentionally obsolete. Everybody talks about how this thing here, the iPhone, runs great until you update it to the newest version, and suddenly it's out of power so fast. Why? They do it on purpose. They were taken to court by the Europeans over exactly that. They were breaking their own stuff so you would buy the newest model. $1,000, $1,500 phones now. You believe that? You'd have to work 200 hours at minimum wage to buy a new iPhone at 1,500 bucks. Not to mention the taxes they'd take out, not to mention the sales tax you pay on top of that, right? Out of control. Costs are out of control for how much we're earning. And that fundamental issue is blatantly being ignored by the boomer generation. We have every reason to be angry at them for how they're dealing with the problems of the world and are being so myopic. My investment portfolio, I need to be able to retire. Meanwhile, the cost of everything, medicine included, that they're going to have to deal with, they're going to get bankrupted as they enter the nursing homes and stuff. They're going to get cleaned out. That's a whole industry now, in fact. Cleaning out old people of what little inheritance they would potentially leave their kids behind after they die. All to make, you know, CEOs of places like United Healthcare a little bit wealthier, because it'll make my stock portfolio go up just a little bit. I'll get a little bit more dividend, right? It's this short term thinking is murdering us because they were always short term thinkers. They were only cared about what their parents would do for them next because that was how they were showed love. You get stuff, you get free stuff, and doted on with stuff by traumatic parents who were arbitrary, you know, or too rigid, or whatever was wrong with them. But they raised these children as the bounty of their reward, so to speak, after living through all that stuff they went through. So I have understanding, and I would say I would have mercy if they would just let go. But they're not letting go, and they're traumatizing us still, and our generation, my generation. I raised my daughter probably too controlling when I really get down to it. I know my ex certainly had control issues. Not to get into that. I'm certainly not blaming anybody or anything like that. Whatever. My own issues. But the thing is we were taught, we were abandoned. She was abused, and not in a terrible way. Just their parents were just violent, They were kids when they had her too, and they had four of them. But they were entitled. Her father especially so. God, he was the oldest son of a really backwards thinking culture that it's a whole thing. But so we were raised and figured out what we didn't want for our daughter. But we were very protective. We got to keep that chaos out of here. And we were focused on her and make sure that she developed and she got all the best, and make sure that she, in the same way that my mother was kind of raised by her parents. And I'm sure that, that carries forward in some way that I don't quite understand with my own daughter, Now, not to say she has grand issues or any of that other shit. She's very accomplished and an exceptional student and all that other stuff. But my own wounds informed how I raised my child. And if she has children, the wounds she received from us, though we didn't actually intend it, will be carried on by her in some weird way that's going to change how their kids are going to work out. Now, millennials are much less independent than we are. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I'm just saying it's different because our independence is kind of a fault in Generation X. We always talk about how, our parents turned us out as soon as the sun came up. Don't come home till dinner, Yes, that happened, and you'd ride your bike around the neighborhood. They didn't know where you were. They didn't care. You were out of their hair. That's all that mattered. We get kidnapped and stuff. They only started putting that together, in the 90s, really. And then those kids, all of a sudden, you had helicopter parents who had been damaged by their parents who were like, I'm going to make sure my kid doesn't have these problems. They're not abandoned. They're not, but they were like all involved in their lives and just constantly on them all the time, right? You listen to millennials talk, and that's a common theme for them. Their parents were too involved. Their parents were way too up in their business, and they were annihilated by media, by TV. They had 200 channels starting from scratch when they were little. And then even younger, into the millennial generation, you have the iPhone kids, where their parents would just throw this thing at them and they were occupied. They were totally occupied. Yeah, I remember seeing a video of this kid who had a book, and or no, it was like a picture or something. It was something, but this little child started trying to swipe left on it and it wouldn't turn, and it was very confused by this because of how it had been brought up by the technology. Parenting is hard, man. It is tiresome. I can't blame them. My own daughter, I remember one time we felt so guilty. She fell asleep watching the TV. She was in one of those little, uh, uh, we called it a battle station, but it was this little round thing that you would put the baby up and they could potentially walk in it, but you could lock it down, and it was just a place that little toys and stuff. Just watch the TV, kid. God, just so tired, you know. And she passed out in that chair. We didn't even notice, and we were like, "Oh my God, we are horrible people," you know. They survive. There is that. But I contrast this to the time that my mother was unaware that it was JFK or MLK Day at my school when I was in kindergarten, which she took me to a school that was 5 miles away because she had hangups about an old boyfriend who had lived in that neighborhood, and she loved to drive around there. That's why I was there. That is the simple reason why I went to that school. She drove 5 miles through Seattle to drop my ass off at this place, not paying attention to the fact that it was a school holiday. So I try to get into the school, and there's a janitor, and he's like, "There's no school, kid. Go home." How am I going to do that? You know? So I screw around in the playground for a little while, but I get bored. I'm like, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go home because I'm 5. I don't know any better. I remember the route. I remember the route to get home. It was a dangerous route. It was along all these crazy, not boulevards that had lots of intersections, and I could barely read. And I remember various aspects of that trek home that I spent the whole day, that cold January day, probably that would be 1983, I suppose, uh, wandering through West Seattle, down Marginal, into White Center, through all that crazy traffic. I had always wanted to see what was at that flag in the triangle intersection in the center of White Center. It was a little town. And I went out there to look, and I couldn't read it. It was too complicated. So, okay, all right, move on. Walked all the way down Ambom, went down 26th, down that dangerous ass road, and got home as the sun was setting, but no one was there. I was hungry and tired. Nobody had stopped. People had honked when I was being stupid in the street, could have gotten hit very easily. Wandered through the woods near Kmart, where a bunch of people would take their, stolen goods and tear apart the packaging and the whatever theft prevention systems that didn't work. The tapes, those big long plastic things. Murder woods, I suppose it could have been. All that stuff. Got there. No one was home, so I turned around and started walking back. And finally, when it was dark, a cop found me. And he's like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "No," And so they take me in to the police station as a found child, obviously missing, trying to figure out my parents. Well, what had been happening, this is something very interesting. What had been happening is they finally figured out I was missing at like 3 or whatever when my mother finally went there, and they're like, "No, nobody's been in school all day. It's a holiday, dummy. Where's your kid at, by the way?" And so the city of Seattle was looking for this missing kid. And there was a little bit of a manhunt for me. There was an APB out for me. But the thing is, I'd cross county lines into King County, and there was different jurisdiction. The sheriff of King County is a different thing. And they had no real line of communication between these two police departments. And so while on one side of the border of King County and Seattle, the police are like, "We're looking for this missing kid. Where's this missing kid?" And on the other side of the King County, they're like, "Whose kid is this?" Finally, someone had the wherewithal to be like, you know what, let's check with Seattle and see if they're looking for any. Oh, wow, you are? Oh, he matches this description perfectly. Did anybody think to talk to anybody from the county that he lived in compared to the city that he was missing from, you know? And it actually ended up becoming a little change in their policy where when kids go missing, they actually talk to each other now. Hey, who's to say I didn't have an impact on the world? You know what I mean? But that's because my mother wasn't paying attention. This is the kind of thing that I went through. So I don't know which is worse, being born down upon by overprotective parents like a lot of millennials did, or having parents that just weren't paying attention at all. We all are carrying our own wounds. But millennials, because the boomers won't let go and we can't take over, I'm 50 years old almost, and none of us are in power. We have a Speaker of the House, but we'll probably never have a Gen X president. It's almost certain that we won't. It'll be a millennial next, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that millennials, sorry guys, the burden's on you. We'll be here to help you and mentor you, but there's just not enough of us, and we got our own stuff. But we'll help you. We're pretty good at that. We figured stuff out. We had to. We didn't have a choice. We had to figure things out because if we didn't, it just wouldn't happen. Um, but they're still hanging on. These boomers, 80, 90 years old in office and stuff, just getting murdered by their policies from an era long ago. You know, Nancy Pelosi? Nancy Pelosi had her first child when Fidel Castro took over Cuba. That was a long ass time ago. What does she know about what's going on in the country? Now, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. I think that is a stupid dynamic. It's wealthy and connected. It's the Epstein files thing that's happening now should probably underscore to people. This is about a caste, not about they have their factions, just like everyone else. It's the same as, Ford or Chevy, Pepsi or Coke. They're the same thing. But not only that, she's worth $500 million now. She didn't start out that way. She only made 200 out of her $500 million in the past couple of years because of the bets she made on Nvidia. Because she went balls deep in that investment, we know because of the few disclosure laws we have. As she wrote the law that said that the United States would get involved in their chip development business because they saw the AI thing coming. People who followed Nancy Pelosi in all of her investments as aggressively as they could made out very well. In fact, there was a Twitter account called the Pelosi Tracker or something like that. And they shut that thing down because it would keep track of what she was doing and people would follow it and do exactly the same thing. If you can't beat them, join them. It's not a bad strategy at all, it turns out. So she's disconnected, profiting off of her position in power, and ancient as hell. She doesn't know what's going on with us, and that's true of most of these people in office. We can't get rid of them. They're dying out. And the thing is I remember Strom Thurmond rolling around at 100 years old, literally 100 years old, being rolled around the Senate floor. Strom Thurmond was from South Carolina, which I didn't know much about. Now I do. Strom Thurmond was a Dixiecrat. He was one of those guys that switched to the Republican Party because the Democrats were backing civil rights back in the 60s. He was still in power in 2000. He finally gave it up. He finally let go of his position of power. He'd been in power in some office of some sort since 1956. 44 years he had been pulling the strings in this country in the capacity that he had. He died 3 months after he left office of old age. Not any grand conspiracy there. The man lived way longer than he had any rights to. But we're going to see the same thing with the boomers. The well-heeled among them are going to live long lives, and they're going to stay in power no matter how addled they become. Dianne Feinstein, She'd had brain surgery and stuff like that and was being wheeled in to make votes in Congress. Same with John McCain. He had came out of whatever awful situation to pass the killer on Obamacare or whatever it was. I forget what it was. You know, this is how things are operated in this country. We put these geriatric people and they never let go. They never let go and they vote the way they're told a lot of the time. They don't vote their conscience. They've been so disconnected from the American people for decades. They don't know anything about what's going on. I don't know how to fix that, but that's what we are seeing with the boomers, and they're not going to let go until we will not be a majority population. Or we will not outnumber the boomers. More accurately, we'll never be a majority, but we won't outnumber the boomers, Generation X, until we're in our 70s, assuming life expectancy continues to decline in this nation, because we're making America great again. But all this has to come down to institutional trauma that are not well, it's institutional, I suppose you could say. It's about the society. This is all about the trauma that was pressed upon them by their parents and the resulting selfishness and myopia, just pure solipsism. If it's not happening to me, it's not happening at all. Of that generation as a whole. And again, generalizations are bad. They really are, because people get treated unfairly when they aren't guilty of the crime. Okay. And not to be, because this affects me a little bit, you know, I may have a certain skin color, but I think a very different way than some others who happen to have the same skin color. And I think those people are either absolutely ridiculous hypocrites or sons of bitches. You know, I don't want to judge anybody by their immutable characteristics, and I hope in return nobody judges me the same way. And that's not always the case. It sucks when that happens. You know, I hate the term white because that just puts all of us into this big glommed category as if we are all one monolithic people that all think the same way and are all guilty of the same crimes, both either of our ancestry, which I don't believe any of my ancestors had anything to do. We weren't even in America until the 1880s, 1890s, any of us. So holding us all to account for the crimes of the Anglos, when I'm Celtic, Celtic and Scandinavian, the Anglos did hard by us too. Let's not forget that the island of Ireland had 3 million people on it in 1840, and by 1850 it had one. A million of them came here, and a million of them starved to death, and that was done by the Anglos, the English. Right? It's not something most people think about. Most of this country, a good chunk of the white people in this country are Irish or part Irish for that reason. They were starved out of their home. We, we didn't have the same hardship that African Americans did, not by a long shot. I'm not trying to compare our grievances. I'm just saying we all got hard put by here. That's kind of what the tale of America is. Most of us we were either driven here or we fled here, you know. But anyway, immutable characteristics, such as your age, you shouldn't, as an individual, be judged by. You need nuance, right? I'm not going to say every single boomer I've ever met is a selfish, myopic person who only wants stuff for themselves and hates their kids. And I'm not going to say they aren't. But there's a trend of that generation, and that has to do with their cultural upbringing. You know, and I'll contrast one other thing. In the wake of World War II, we won those wars. You know, you had the big kiss on the cover of Life magazine, and we demanded absolute surrender, complete and unconditional surrender from the country of Japan, and reinvented it. And we were the wonder of the world, starting in the 1940s. All this technological development, all this industry, all this other stuff. And the people who returned from those wars were lionized, and while that doesn't make up for the traumas they suffered, but they were well viewed by society. You won, guys. Good job. You saved the world. And if there was ever a crusade, it was against the imperialists and the fascists. who are trying to take everything over. And both sides, Japan and Germany, they had genocide written into their code of ruling. Both of them did. And we stopped it. Just awesome, man. So awesome. But you get into the 60s and 70s, the boomer generation, they're being shipped off to war in Vietnam. And that is a chess game of geopolitics, a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States to see how well we can change the culture of this country by hitting them with napalm and Agent Orange and stuff like that. And the guys that would get wounded, they just jammed them up with opiates and barbiturates and stuff, these heavy drugs that just, here you go, kid. You're missing an arm? That sucks for you. Have a bunch of heroin, you know? Not heroin, but something chemically similar. They'd hook these guys up on the most aggressive drugs possible and then bring them home and just dump them out. Go back home. And we lost that war. We finally left with our tail between our legs out of Vietnam because it was too costly and those people were not going to let go. You know, the Viet Cong, you know, commies or whatever that they were fighting for their homeland against a terrible force. We're doing terrible things in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Awful things. Now, Pol Pot was worse. Yes. He was actively mass executing whole towns and stuff, then dumping their asses into mass graves. So in a comparison, I guess we're a little better than Pol Pot, but not by much. You hear all the tales of what happened in Vietnam. And then they didn't even bother winning that war because, you know, it's the same challenge that MacArthur faced with Korea. There's just, you can't go any further. These monsters are being fed. And because of the state of politics, you can't do anything more about it except fight them up to the border. MacArthur got in trouble because he fought strategically against the Northern Koreans. He saw what was happening, and they were squeezing him out in the middle of the peninsula, and he did an end run around the back and flanked him from behind. Absolutely took over the entire peninsula. That was not supposed to be part of the plan. He took all of Korea, all of it, and had control over it. We won. He was like, we did it. Except the problem was the Chinese kept sending in soldiers from the north, and he couldn't. He's like, we got to invade China now. And of course, Truman is like, no. You'll start World War III. And enough of his men died that he said, okay, we have to do something about this. All right, we either give this place up or we take over, we go invade China because we're just getting our asses kicked here now. MacArthur was recalled to Washington because the president openly said this is to prevent World War III. And he faded into obscurity, and Korea was split in half. Interesting that, because that was not a war about Korea at all. Just like Vietnam was not a war about Vietnam at all. It was about the Soviet Union and the United States in a pissing match. Millions of people were killed in these two conflicts. And for what? You know, pride, national, you know, the strength of the ideology behind capitalism and communism. That's what it was about. But anyway, boomers come back from Vietnam and they're hooked on drugs, and they lost that war. They were not well viewed by their parents. You're losers. You didn't finish the job. We did when we were your age. Back in my day, we fought Hitler in the trenches and bombed his ass to hell, and we won that victory. And you guys came home and you're hooked on drugs. Shame on you. That was the message those guys got. And then they had us. You know, don't be too hard on the boomers. Be angry about their actions. That's fair, because they're messing this up. They're tearing this country down, ripping the wiring out of the ceilings and the walls and selling it for scrap. in their desperate last gasp to get what else they can, because that is what makes them feel value if you really get down to it. But there are underlying reasons for that, just as there are underlying reasons for the way we act and the way our children will act. But one thing I can say is a little bit about our generation. We're a little more aware of mental health and trying to pay attention to why we do the things we do. The younger generations, even more so, they're more in tune. I had one situation where, I was getting hooked into this video game that I was invited to, and it started making me anxious because that's what those games are designed to do. They're designed to make you feel like you have to keep playing. You have to keep playing or you're going to lose your friends. I'm going to do a video on that because that's another interesting subject. But and I finally backed away in my independent Gen X way. Okay, everybody, I'm sorry I can't be your friend, more or less. Is kind of how I was saying it. It wasn't meant that I was shutting them out. It's just I can't keep up with this game, and it's making me actually miserable trying to do so, and so I have to say goodbye to you all. And these millennials were like, no, you're not saying goodbye to us. We're going to accommodate for you. We're going to create a new environment that doesn't involve this game, and we're going to keep talking and hanging out and playing around, doing other stuff. It just won't involve this game. And I was like, you don't have to do that. And they're like, yes, we do. You're telling us that you're having a hard time, and we're accommodating for you. That's how we do. Thanks, guys. Right? So in that regard, they got an unlock where over us. They're doing way better about this stuff than we are, and they can help us out quite a lot. Don't look down. That's my big advice. Don't look down at somebody just because they're younger than you. They got a lot to tell you. They got a lot of wisdom in that generation as well. Never turn wisdom away from any source, but be mindful of your own biases as you get older. Yes, you know a lot of stuff and you've experienced a lot of stuff, but they see things differently and they can share a viewpoint that you may not know. And maybe we can be maybe not less traumatized, but at least better able to handle it. All right, that's it.